Today, let's look at why toxic positivity can, well, be so toxic. Hang on. Toxic positivity, talk about an oxymoron, right? It can be confusing to people because what does that mean? How can positivity be toxic? How can it be a bad thing? Well, it can be a bad thing when it's used as a way to hide from the truth, when it's used to mask our feelings, when it's used to not be authentic on some level, when it's used to go through life with some sort of rose-colored glass look at things, when it's used to repress our feelings, deny our feelings, when it's used to not deal with the hardcore truth of something. So it can be very problematic in one's life. It can stem, quite often it does stem from children who are abused on some level growing up. They've had a very difficult childhood, a traumatic childhood. One of your coping mechanisms growing up was to try to act like everything's okay. You're walking on eggshells. There's enough tension in the family anyhow, and you don't want to add to it. So one way to cover up was to just make everything be okay. To talk about things in a quote unquote positive way, even though they weren't positive at all. And we can see how that's sad, right? That's sad to me right now as I'm saying that. When we think about a child or an adult having to mask their real feelings, always thinking ahead about, I better frame it this way, I better say it that way. I won't be accepted if I look at things this way or verbalize it this way. So I better say it this way. So we're always thinking, always ready, always trying to anticipate. And usually that stems from our childhood. So then we grow up, and as an adult, we're doing the same thing, and maybe even raising our kids. Our family is being conditioned in this way. Well, it's not healthy and it's not helpful. It's going to cause problems along the way somewhere. It's a belief that you have to be an optimist. You have to be cheerful. And this has to happen no matter how bad a situation is. Something could be horribly wrong, but you're still like, well, let's look at the silver lining. Well, sometimes things are just bad. Sometimes things suck. Sometimes there's no happy ending. That's part of life, right? That happens to all of us. Yes, it's okay in general to try to look at the glass as half full, but not in some sort of obsessive compulsive sort of way where every single thing has to be viewed in a positive light. Then we know there's an issue there. This minimizes the fact that we're human and we have human emotions, and our emotions can change quite a lot sometimes. Let them change. Let them be. Acknowledge what's going on now. Don't try to cover them up all the time. You know it's toxic when it's taking every situation to some sort of extreme. Everything's good, everything's okay. So if somebody's telling you a story that's just horrible, maybe they were hit by a car last week and they're in the ICU right now. Maybe they're calling you on the phone and telling you about what happened. And you're compelled to say, well, you're choosing to be unhappy. Well, not necessarily. They need to process and talk about what they've been through, the trauma. They need to just let that be and let that out. Or let's say somebody lost both of their parents on the same day, and they're very upset about it, and rightly so. And a good friend says to them, well, everything happens for a reason. That's not helpful at the moment, and it's sort of minimizing that person's grief and loss. Let them have their grief and loss. Let them share it. Be there as a shoulder for them. Help them through it on that level. Now, if they're still complaining and grief-stricken and not functioning in life 4 years later, then it's worth saying to them, you know what? Let's examine this. And maybe then they could get some therapeutic help. But initially, it is what it is. Or maybe somebody's home has burnt down. There's nothing left. They're upset. They call you, you're talking to them, and you say, well, let's look on the bright side. The bright side is you can go out and buy a new home now. Well, that may not also be the most helpful thing to say at that moment. They're going to need to grieve and be sad and feel the loss of this home that perhaps they lived in for years. So for the toxic positive people out there, ask yourself, what emotions are you trying to hide from? What is uncomfortable for you? It's actually more about you at this point than it is about them. What feels so uncomfortable? What are you running from? Perhaps you don't know what to say. Are you tongue-tied? Then let yourself be tongue-tied and say to the person, I honestly don't know what to say right now, but I want you to know I do care about you. I'm here for you if you need me. That's enough sometimes in these circumstances. You don't have to put a smiley face on everything. What it does by covering in this way is it prevents you from growing, and perhaps them from growing too, but again, it's more about you. It's keeping you sort of on this flat line about I need to look at everything, absolutely everything in a positive way. That's going to prevent you from getting to know yourself, growing spiritually, emotionally, and so on. Remind yourself about, I'm kind of avoiding something. What is that about? What are you avoiding? And it can cause guilt and even some shame to the person hearing it because They may be believing that at the time. Well, maybe I am overreacting. Am I too sad? Am I too distraught that my best friend died in a boating accident last week? So we don't want to shame or guilt people into what they're authentically feeling. Just let it be. A therapist, for example, will bring up to the person, tell me what you think the guilt is all about. Tell me what you think the shame is all about. You can explore it on that level, usually with professional help. But that's different from guilting somebody. Why are you feeling that way? You shouldn't feel that way. That makes no sense. Oh my God, I got to hear this again. Those responses are not helpful or appropriate. Or for the toxic positive person, they may have a difficult time with ambivalence, with holding more than one feeling at the same time. Some people, because of childhood trauma, may need to be very rigid, very black and white. Things need to be either or. And that can stem from childhood emotional pain. The problem with that is life is not usually lived in that way. Life is much more about the gray area. It's okay to feel more than one feeling, and yet some people can't do that because it's counter to their coping mechanism from childhood. So then that's a good issue to bring up with a therapist. Why am I so rigid? So some red flags are if you're minimizing people's feelings, shaming them or hiding or somehow disguising how you're feeling, if you tend to just want to brush off people's feelings and your own feelings probably at the same time, if you're a people pleaser and you were raised walking on eggshells, then you probably had to do that during your childhood and now you're trying to project that onto others. So that's what I meant earlier when I said it's more about you, the toxic positive person, than it is about the other person. There's great ways to learn about yourself if you happen to be this way. Try experimenting with it. Try just letting things be, not having to put a happy answer or a happy face to the end of everything. Don't try to fix or save something or someone every time. Just give someone a hug and say, yeah, that is very sad. I'm sorry to hear it. Or listen without having to comment on what they're saying to you. Just take it in. Perhaps they're sharing some grief. Then what does that feel like for you to just let it be? Pay attention to your feelings at that point. Are you just chomping at the bit to get in there and sort of make things better? Then that probably goes back to childhood when you had to try to make things better when your parents were arguing in the other room. I better go in there and hug my mommy and my daddy because things are kind of tense right now. And maybe you would, and maybe it would soothe things over between your parents. But that's not your role, and it wasn't your role when you were a kid either. But that's how you were conditioned. That was your training. So now you're working on it as an adult by letting these things be, seeing what feelings come up for you, and allowing yourself and others to simply be more human. So in the comment section, if you'd like, please leave me some examples you may have about toxic positivity. Please subscribe to my mental health YouTube channel if you like these kind of videos. And until next week, this is Brad Shore signing off from Ask a Shrink.